In the 19th century, Eugene Schieffelin had introduced the starling to Central Park because he wanted to bring all the birds mentioned in the plays of Shakespeare to New York. And it only ever got one sentence. The implication was that he was totally nuts because the introduction of the starling has been pretty much an ecological disaster. From the population of 90 that he brought over originally, there are now millions and millions, and they pick farmers' crops clean, and they boot native cavity nesters out of their holes. And the biologists who were writing these textbooks had no idea what he could have been thinking. And I thought when I read all of those things, well, I could have done that. I like Shakespeare and I like birds, and if I didn't have a sense of ecology and of the dangers of exotic species, if it had been 100 years ago, that's a major disaster that I could imagine myself causing. So I got interested in the idea of, well, what did people think about non-native species 100 years ago? And what sense of ecological systems did they have? So I started researching Schieffelin and starlings, and that led me to pigeons, and that led me to gypsy moths, and that led me to the sea lamprey, and that led me here. So I'm going to start out by reading a little bit from the introduction, sort of as background. Conjure up a landscape. On the cusp of city and country, a place where birds and cars make equal noise. Somewhere typically American. Stroll by one of the last houses on the edge of town, the one with the messy lawn. Dandelions poke through long stalks of Kentucky bluegrass. House sparrows fluff brown feathers in the hedge, and starlings probe the soil with yellow beaks. Flower gardens give way to fields, and a calf stumbles to its feet in the tall timothy. Honeybees fumble at nodding thistles. Further out, as the road turns to dirt, a ring-necked pheasant flushes out of the bushes, croaking, sun catching his iridescent neck. Brown trout arc and break the surface of a stream leading into the woods. Though the scene might look familiar, glance back. None of the species that swim, fly, or take root in this dreamscape is native to the United States. They evolved in Asia, Africa, or Europe, shaped by foreign rivers and grasslands, and have managed to thrive on this far continent. Since Europeans began settling the area we now call America, exotic species have flooded in, becoming so prevalent that many Americans can't say which plants and animals are native and which are not. While often invisible to the naked eye, changes in landscapes and ecosystems develop as these species take up residence here and begin to breed. Exotics may have contributed to the decline of 49% of threatened and endangered species. On the other hand, other non-native species are inextricably tied to the way most of us live, and their homey presence permitted the success of English, Spanish, and French colonists in this land pulsing with strange beasts. Currently, more than 4,500 exotic creatures buzz, creep, and wing their way over American soil, and each has a very specific, very compelling history. While many newspaper and magazine articles point out the disasters unleashed with these species, few look deeply at why people wanted to release them in the first place. Many of the animals came over in boats traveling from the Old World. While colonists brought germs in their lungs and rats on their ships unintentionally, they carried other creatures here by design, following an impulse as old as Noah's Ark to recreate a remembered country across the sea. Settlers in New France shipped over rock doves to keep as pets, little imagining the hordes of pigeons that would grow with the country's cities. In 1890, Eugene Schieffelin, a Manhattan drug manufacturer, went on a crusade to release European birds into Central Park, and the starlings he set free are the ancestors of those that sit clicking and squawking on telephone wires from Miami to Spokane. Newspaper editor E.B. Webster transported mountain goats to the Olympic Peninsula, and astronomer Leopold Trouvelot brought gypsy moths to Massachusetts. These men were looking to adjust the world as they found it, to tinker with the Garden of Eden. They had visions, and they wanted to build them out of cells rather than stone. As new technology made transportation easier and quicker, more and more visionaries picked up animals out of one environment and set them free in another. Why? As I tried to answer this question, I looked at 16 different species brought over at 16 different periods in history, starting with the pigeons, which came over in about 1600, and looking at contemporary experiments with exotic insects, which were brought over to eat exotic weeds as a form of biological control. I focused them for the most part on animal species because they were the easiest to track through history. A lot of the plant species, just someone, took a pocket full of seeds from their home country and brought them over here, which was very difficult to document. But because animals are harder to move, they left more of a paper trail. And I also found that I was really interested in the way that the country was created biologically as much as it was created socially or culturally or legally. People didn't only sit down and say, well, what kind of laws do we want this new society to have? They sat down and said, well, what kind of plants and animals do we want this new society to have? Because maybe we're not content with the ones that are here already. And while a lot of times species or introductions are presented as the whim of one strange individual, I think the introduction of the starling by the Shakespeare aficionado being the most apt to that point. As I dug through, I really began to see how they were more products of a cultural moment. I mean, even Eugene Schaeffelin introducing his starlings, well, he was a member of a society called the American Acclimatization Society, which were all these people specifically devoted to bringing over plants and animals that would be of benefit to the country. And there wasn't only the American Acclimatization Society. There was one in Portland, Oregon, and there was one in Cincinnati. So it was part of a larger cultural movement. And you look at the 1930s when nutria were brought over, and people thought that they were going to earn their way out of the Depression by raising these animals, which would make very valuable fur coats. And then the fur turned out not to be very valuable at all, and they set them free in the swamps. And the part that I'm going to read from now is about a moment in the 1860s when people were really looking for a way to start an American silk industry. Silk had to be imported either from Europe or from China, and people thought if only we could find a kind of silkworm which we could raise here, which would survive the Northeast winters, then America could have its own silk industry and we wouldn't be so dependent on foreign imports. This chapter is called Following Silk Threads. Events that summer unfolded with the grim predictability of a horror story. Though predating Hollywood B-movies such as The Deadly Mantis, Arachnophobia, or The Fly, the tale featured all the elements of a hack screenwriter's fantasy. The mad scientist, a repulsive creature invading a suburban neighborhood, women shrieking when they opened their closets. One slip, one tipped vial, and cities along the East Coast lived under swarming hordes of insect larvae that stripped apple and oak trees, wormed their way into houses, and turned and rose in a mad flutter of wings. Despite pesticides and predators, they spread, outbreak by outbreak, leaving a trail of bare branches and disgust. Eventually, the storyline veered beyond anything a cinema screen could hold. In a modest house at 27 Myrtle Street in Medford, Massachusetts, in 1868, Leopold Trouvelot, an astronomer with a knack for natural history, was trying to breed a better silkworm. He imported several European gypsy moth eggs, planning to cross them with a North American species. If his efforts succeeded, he would jumpstart the silk industry in the United States and boost his own fortunes as well. When several of the moths escaped one warm day in 1868, the plot ground into motion. Trouvelot must have shivered when he heard the clink of broken glass or found a tear in his backyard netting. Having witnessed the ravages of the native silkworm, he's noted what a destruction this single species of insect could make if only 1/100th a part of the eggs laid came to maturity. Panic knifes through him as he searches the grass, and he tells everyone he knows to be wary. But his mind can't possibly encompass the destruction that will follow, the acres defoliated and millions spent on pesticides, any more than he could picture a man on the moon. 10 years later, Trouvelot was gone. His warnings were forgotten. Mr. William Taylor moved to number 27. Exploring the shed and the back of his new property, he found the walls crawling with caterpillars. He quickly sold the enclosure, but the insects persisted. In their season, I used to gather them literally by the quart before going to work in the morning, he wrote. The neighbors, first those who lived close to the astronomer, then those who lived farther down the block, began to notice something seriously wrong. They told story after story of discomfort verging on the unbearable. Next door to Trouvelot's old home, Mrs. William Belcher couldn't ignore the newcomers. They were all over the inside of the house as well as the trees. Another neighbor noted, the caterpillars could get into the house in spite of every precaution. We would even find them on the clothing hanging in the closets. Several houses away in 5 Myrtle, Mrs. D.W. Daly waged a personal battle against the moths and their larvae. I spent much time in killing caterpillars, she reported. I used to sweep them off the side of the house and get dustpans full of them. At night we could hear the caterpillars eating in the trees and their excrement dropping to the ground. Then, in 1889, things started to get really bad. Having denuded Myrtle Street, the gypsy moth spread block by block and flourished with the new food supply. As the caterpillars fell from the trees, one man covered his head with his coat and ran to catch the train to work. But at the station, he found his jacket lining squirming with them. A woman described the embarrassment of having to sweep off her front steps every time the guests stopped by, so they wouldn't arrive with their shoes covered with insects. Masses of caterpillars blackened house fronts. Days were filled with raking and burning piles of leaves infested with caterpillars, pouring boiling water over caterpillars marching along fences, picking caterpillars off the wash and from underneath the pillows. Many people stayed inside on hot summer days to avoid insects in their hair and clothes. The stench of dead bugs hung over Medford like smoke, intensifying in the summer heat. The noise of the feeding insects sounded like the clipping of scissors, a breeze, or the pattering of very fine raindrops, and whoever heard them knew she could wake up to a yard full of skeleton plants. Some tried to move out of the neighborhood, but were invariably met by questions about the trees, leafless and bare in June. One glance at a caterpillar crawling across a trouser cuff, and the prospective house buyer was gone. The outbreak progressed. The state launched its own attack. In 1890, the Massachusetts legislature gathered a commission to halt the progress of the gypsy moth. Teams of men descended on egg clusters and burned them, sprayed them with acid, doused them with oil, and coated them with tar and varnish. Individual trees of sentimental or commercial interest were girdled with tar paper in hopes that caterpillars would stick, unable to cross. Others were wrapped with burlap, which lured caterpillars to its shelter so that managers could remove and destroy them. They sprayed Paris green, London purple, and other arsenic-based poisons over the hatched caterpillars, attempting to kill them before they bred. Explorers scoured Europe and Asia for an insect that might prey on the gypsy moth, and in 1909, researcher George Clinton returned from Japan with a fungus believed to cripple the larva, but it vanished into the Massachusetts forest, and the moths continued their hungry progress. It's interesting to note that a fungus that kills gypsy moths has actually reappeared, and they're not completely sure if it's sort of a more virulent strain of the 1909 fungus that was brought over, or if it's something completely new. I'm going to move forward in time a little bit now to the 1960s, which was another cultural moment where exotic species sort of flooded in. And what was happening then was that scientists developed a vaccine for parrot fever. So all of a sudden, all of these birds which hadn't been able to be imported because people were afraid that they were diseased, the ban was lifted, and parrots began to flood in. All of these tropical birds began to flood in, and perhaps not surprisingly, they also began to appear in parks and in zoos and in middle of cities. And most didn't survive the rough winters, but one that did particularly well and actually seemed to be thriving was the monk parakeet. And there's a population of monk parakeets that lives in Hyde Park near Chicago, and I went looking for them there. And I have to tell you that there's no place less likely to see this tropical parakeet than Chicago as winter is coming on. But there's a zoology professor there who had given me a hint as to where sometimes he saw them. Wandering through the park on the west side of the university, looking up hopefully at soggy squirrels' nests, I check and recheck the map the professor drew for me of nest sites and good spots for parakeet watching. Cars surge by on a broad avenue. Even in this scrap of... It's hard to imagine how a native species could make a living. Roads and sidewalks, office buildings and apartment houses slice up the environment into discrete chunks. Most of the plants are exotic and might not offer much in the way of food to a creature reliant on North American flowers. While I'm hunting for an exotic, how much more startling would it be to see a native species here, one that evolved to make use of plants and habitats nowhere found in this maze of asphalt and landscaping. Then, just past an empty playground, the parakeets have left their mark. If monk parakeets represent the only parrots to build a nest, which they do, they don't take their responsibility lightly. This is no soup bowl of sticks. To call these structures nests stretches the word beyond recognition. One sprawls where a branch forks into three, relaxing as far up one of the prongs as gravity will allow. Another is woven into twigs at the end of a limb, using the living tree as building materials. A third attaches to the tree only at the top and hangs down, swaying in the fall breeze. Messy heaps of twigs, some as big as overstuffed chairs, the nests seem to hold their shape by magic, displaying no structural principle that keeps them from collapsing. Multiple entrances tunnel into the masses, leading up to 20 separate chambers. In this way, they're more like airborne burrows than nests, as if the parakeets were building a new earth, higher than the first, dismissing the pedestrian ground. This mini-world attracts other animals, just as a house may inadvertently shelter mice and spiders. Ducks lay eggs on top of the structures, as if they were patches of brushy lakeshore. House sparrows nest in the twigs at the edges. In Argentina, when the cavities aren't occupied by parakeets, American kestrels and speckled teals move in. This afternoon, though, the nests appear completely still and empty, like abandoned shacks. I didn't see any parakeets that day, but I came back really early the next morning. 2 days later, still hoping to see parakeets at close range, I head to Hyde Park on the east side of the university in the pearl light before sun. The few people on the sidewalk seem wrapped in sleep, brushing aside dream fragments as they move toward their cars. On the neat park lawn, pigeons carpet the grass. Parakeet chatter floats from the trees, but when I look up, starlings fly off, still mimicking their neighbors. Their cries only highlight the stillness of the benches and quiet tennis court. As the professor promised, a huge nest drapes the branches of a tree at the south edge of the park, but in the dim light it looks lifeless. Then, in a rush, parakeets erupt. 3 perch on a sapling by the tennis court, backlit by the sun rising on Lake Michigan. Muttering and squawking, a big parakeet shifts his weight from foot to foot in a crook of a branch above the nest. Every now and then he fluffs up his feathers and runs his beak through them. One flies up carrying a stick twice as long as his body and lands by an entrance. Grasping the stick in his beak, the bird works it into the underside of the nest, twisting and poking until the twig disappears into the mass. Then the parakeet soars off and returns with another prize, continuing renovations. A golden retriever, delirious to be off leash, bounds through the grass, scattering pigeons in a rush. When they settle, 2 parakeets join them, green among the gray, all pecking at the grass. For some, these birds are the zany, exotic heart of the neighborhood. Underneath those broad-shouldered suits and Midwestern bluster, these Chicagoans are tender-hearted. When the parakeets first started building up a population in the Hyde Park neighborhood in the late 70s and 80s, they were immediately embraced. When an early summer storm uprooted a tree hosting 2 nests, phone calls asking about the birds' welfare flooded into the Hyde Park Chamber of Commerce. If a nest fell, residents tried to rescue the chicks and find them homes. The former mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington, treasured the parakeets roosting across from the street from his apartment and adopted them as personal mascots. He claimed he could never lose while they nested there. After he died, still in office, the papers reported that the parakeets began building in a tree outside the Harold Washington branch of the Disabled Museum of African American History. When the USDA geared up for a second round of parakeet elimination in the late 1980s, Hyde Park residents formed the Harold Washington Memorial Parrot Defense Fund, complete with baseball caps reading "Parrot Trooper," and threatened to sue. The birds remained. People still complain when Con Edison, the electric utility, tears down nests built around transformers. The birds seek out the heat-emitting sites, but more than once the stick heaps have burst into flame. As in San Francisco, exotic parrots have been embraced as a symbol of the city's diversity, tolerance, and desirability. People say they are flattered that the birds have chosen their communities, have chosen them. With the entire Hyde Park population lingering at about 250, there are few enough for them to be pets. Pets of blocks, pets of neighborhoods, pets of cities. They rip dandelions from the grass and add to their weighty nests, and I know what I should think. My rational mind urges that they should be exterminated. It's no use waiting until the parakeets start to cause serious damage or until the populations are so big they're impossible to control. But as I watch them swirl the air over the park, I must admit there's an unmistakable joy in this. And it's very bad of me to say that. It's very bad of me to say something nice and pleasurable about exotic species, but I wanted to give in to that feeling even just for a moment because that's how all these animals got here. People looked at them and thought, how beautiful, how lovely. And monk parakeets are such an interesting example because they are walking on that cusp between pet and pest. And John was saying the different names that we use to refer to non-native species. And one of them is invasive species. And that's a specific name given to exotic species which have the capability to completely take over a landscape and outcompete all the native plants or animals living there. And then there are other species which are sort of benign. You know, you plant it in your garden and it stays there and never puts out a seed and never spreads any further. And monk parakeets are right on the edge of that. So they're an interesting example to look at. But I didn't want to end on that overly happy note because also as John pointed out, exotic species are a huge problem. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the end of the book. And I wrote this part. I had gone to the archives at the Smithsonian to do some research there. And I was sitting on the steps of the Natural History Museum and looking out over the lawn there. It was just like looking at a big non-native species display. There were pigeons and there were starlings and there were house sparrows and they were all eating the leftovers from the kids' lunches, all living their very successful lives. It's tempting, as one looks at this scene, to wish it all away, to conjure, instead of the familiar countryside this book opened with, the landscape that met the first European explorers as they eased their ships up to the beach. A forest awake, stirring with the noise of thousands of passenger pigeons roosting in beech trees, rustling the branches, cooing to one another. Lake trout filling the Great Lakes and West Slope cutthroat healthy on the west slope of the Rockies. The Olympic Peninsula pushing up towering spruce trees with timber wolves skirting their bases. Salmon surging upstream, all slick scales and instinct, back after back, leaving hardly any room for the water. Compared with this vision, these stories of exotic species are steeped in sadness. While they appear tales of addition, subtraction is the underlying theme. The accounting is unforgiving. Instead of a world with passenger pigeons and rock doves, we have only rock doves. Instead of a world with heath hens and ring-necked pheasants, we have only ring-necked pheasants. Instead of a world with Carolina parakeets and monk parakeets, we have only monk parakeets. In this light, the desire rises to see the country before the first European bootprint in the mud, showing off the creatures it molded, the children of its brain and habitats. It would be frightening. It would be awe-inspiring. It would be a place we've never been. So I would love to take some questions if you guys have them. Just a warning at the beginning that there are hundreds of exotic species out there, and I don't know a lot about all of them, but I do know some about the history of some of them. Yeah?
I recently read or saw an article in the Discovery magazine about
Uh-huh.
Sort of painted them in a more positive light. I was wondering what you thought, if you had seen it, what you thought about that.
I hadn't, but this book does talk about some species that are positive, or at least some species where the jury is kind of out. One of them is the monk parakeet. One of them, for instance, is the honeybee. The honeybee is not native. It pollinates pretty much everything that we eat. And there are negative impacts. There have been negative impacts on native pollinators. But for Europeans to come over and replicate the kind of life that they had, honeybees are really necessary. But what were some of the things in the article that talked about as being positive?
I don't remember the other example.
Yeah.
Cows were one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, not only do honeybees pollinate everything that we eat, but most everything that we eat is non-native. And that was one other thing to say. I was going to say, and it just escaped me. But that's another reason that I think biologists have come up with the term invasive species, because that generally covers the ones that people want to talk about as being bad. But yeah, I mean, there's an argument to be made. You know, how much responsibility when you come to a new place do you have to live with what that place has to offer? And it would be a very different country if we had chosen to do that. Yeah.
Have there been any successful attempts to eradicate an invasive species that has really taken hold in a large way?
If you hadn't added that last part, I would say yes. But I think that the effort now is really to look around and do really good monitoring and have top 10 lists of the invasive species that you don't want, and as soon as they come, to stomp on them. And there have been some successful examples of that. But really on a large scale, it's just a question of control. You know, the sea lamprey in the Great Lakes, they spend millions and millions of dollars each year, and it's kind of under control. But it's not like the sea lamprey is gone. But if anyone has any happy story examples, I'd love to hear them. But as far as I've heard, it's really the prevention end, which people are looking at now. You know, Hawaii is completely on armed guard about getting a brown tree snake or many other exotic species. And in that way, we're very far behind places like Australia and New Zealand, where when you go to New Zealand, you have to wash off your boots in a special tray so that you don't carry anything in. And I think the United States is just sort of coming on to that bandwagon. Is there a question over here?
As a writer, do you have any thoughts on what it takes to get people to shift from well-meaning but poorly intentioned thoughts like this is a pet, we're going to take care of it, to seeing their communities as an ecosystem and protecting what really belongs there?
Well, for me, first of these is very hypocritical to say, because I wrote this whole book about non-native species. But I really think that if people have a sense of what their native species are and learn to appreciate their native species, then they can see what's at risk. It won't be like, a lot of these people thought, particularly in the 19th century, it's a blank slate. There's nothing up in Alaska. Let's bring reindeer there. They had no idea. They talked about the Great Plains as a waste of plains. What's there? But I think that if people do get a sense of what plants and animals are native to their communities, and I've been trying to do a lot of writing talking about that, maybe underappreciated species, and bringing them to life for people, is one avenue. And the other avenue is to develop a sense of biological history, which I think is not something people think about. To look at a pigeon and say, does that belong here? How did that get here, and where did it come from? And I think that that's a really interesting new developing field of kind of animal history and human history and how those two things interacted. And it's an area that I'm very interested in. So does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah?
I have a question that's more specifically related to plants.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the invasive species removal that I've been aware of has involved a lot of pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that's been successful
Anything that's been successful,
involves a lot of pesticides.
you said? Yeah.
And I didn't know if you, it's sort of a two-part question, knew of any ways that have been any larger scale eradications of invasive
living with invasive species
Mm-hmm.
in your yard or your community, or using the harsh chemicals for removing them?
I'm not a plant person. I do talk a little bit about that in the chapter because it's really interesting. That issue has split the environmental community, as much as you can call the environmental community a single community. But, I live in Montana where leafy spurge and spotted knapweed are huge problems, and people lose, their entire ranches become covered with spotted knapweed, which their cows won't eat. And, half the people say, kill it, kill it, kill it, whatever you can do, whatever you have to spray on it. And the other people say, why would we want to introduce all of these toxins into our environment? And the chapter that I looked at, where I wrote about that, was a chapter on biological control, where they're bringing in insects native to the country where the plants are from. Again, though, I don't even know of any, maybe you know of any large-scale eradication projects, but that seems very rare. I mean, at least in my state, it's a question of control. And there are methods to, control small populations. People use goats to eat the spotted knapweed. There are patrols who go out on the hills outside of town every weekend and pick up all the weeds they can find. All the spotted knapweed and all the leafy spurge. But again, it's a question of being aware of what's out there, what habitat it's going to invade, and a very educated population to look for it so that when you go out for a hike, you pull it. But yeah, I think there's a quote from a writer in Audubon in here which says that an exotic species' best friend is a chemophobic environmentalist. So there's definitely a lot of passion on either side, but I didn't really choose sides. I just tried to document what was going on there because I didn't feel qualified to say one way or the other. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about the end of the gypsy moth story? Because the way it was going, it seems like we'd be up to our knees in caterpillars. Right?
Well, they're cyclical. So I think you guys can tell me maybe 25 years ago there was a big gypsy moth outbreak here, and as far as my understanding is, they're spread throughout the Northeast, and there's an Asian gypsy moth, which people were worried about coming in more in the West. But again, I think it's like the sea lamprey. There have been some control measures, but really when there's an outbreak, there's an outbreak. And so the reason that you don't see them is that they're between cycles. But anyone has any more information on that, I'd be glad to hear it. Yeah?
In your studies, which of these species do you think has had the greatest impact on sort of the native species?
Wow, single species. Humans? No, aside from humans. It's hard to say, and the reason that I say humans, though it's up for debate whether or not we're exotic species, and I don't necessarily think that we are, but the thing is that we are the biggest destroyers of habitat. And what we do is we create habitat for exotic species that like disturbed habitat. Like, why do pigeons like cities? Because cities are full of rock ledges, which is where they evolved to live. Why does spotted knapweed do so well? Because it likes bare ground that's been churned up, and we do that a lot. So I wouldn't say, since species are specific to different environments, I would say weed plant species have had a big impact in the Intermountain West where I live. Gypsy moths may be here. But I can't say one continental United States wide, although the chapter that I didn't read is about mosquitoes being introduced to Hawaii who brought avian malaria, which pretty much killed off a huge percentage of Hawaii's native birds. So in terms of a massive local impact, I might vote for that. Yeah.
So, what extent do you think it's the economic impacts of introduced species that really motivate people to want to do something about
think it's probably 99% the.
Historically, now than it was.
I would say now it's definitely mostly the economic impact, which has put it on the radar screen. I mean, it's still just getting on the radar screen, as I said, particularly in comparison to a place like New Zealand or Australia, where they've been thinking about it for a long time and they've seen the impacts for a long time. But you look at the zebra mussel, which has had huge economic impacts, and that has really gotten a lot of attention. The same with the sea lamprey. In terms of whether that's changed through time, it's hard to say, because I think it's a new development for the United States, really within the past 100 years, with all the developments in transportation, with things going so quickly, with there being so much disturbed landscape for the species to colonize. So you couldn't say what was the response to a gypsy moth outbreak 200 years ago, because there wasn't. 100 years ago, they were certainly very concerned, and that was because trees had a large economic value and a quality of life value. I still would say that biodiversity is pretty low on what people think about, and I don't think people think about biodiversity a lot in terms of this country. I think people think about, the rainforests of South America. Oh, there's so much biodiversity here. But again, people don't know and understand their native species, so they don't know what's being lost a lot of the time. That's my opinion. Yeah.
Is there any studies on fire ants?
I haven't. I didn't do fire ants, but it comes up a lot. And apparently somebody told me that they lived in Florida and you could never just hang out on a lawn because you get eaten by fire ants. Is that really true? So I was looking for really specific introduction stories, and that might have a great one, but I didn't find out what it was. But yeah.
There's also another, I was in Florida
Uh-huh.
years ago, that's why I know you walk in the grass, like across. And but when I was down there, what I was hearing about is that the Florida panther, was very extremely endangered. So what they had done is they had introduced cougar mountain out west to breed with the Florida panther, because that was the only way they were able to get them breed, because they weren't able to find enough mates out
Yeah.
there and let it inbreed. So they now crossbred them, and what they're starting to see is that, I don't know how much of it's rumor or not, but the Florida panther has never attacked a human, has never had any problems with humans. It's very scared of the human, whereas the out west California species doesn't fear the human, and they're the ones who attack the human. And now, for the first time, I think in the last 2 years ago, they had their first Florida panther incident with a human, and they think it's because of the cougar coming into the panther.
Wow.
That might be something you want to see,
Yeah, that is.
totally change the species as a gene.
Yeah, that is interesting. It doesn't really seem like a Florida panther anymore.
Well, it's like
Yeah, a hybrid. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Florida is another one of those interesting examples where, like, in a way, like the Great Plains, where people treat it a little bit like a blank slate. They're like, this is a sunny place, what can we build here? What can we bring here? Wow, anything will grow and thrive here. We can bring so much. And I think it's only recently that people have started to say, well, there's a lot of amazing things which evolved here, and they're in danger.
Two more questions.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the environment, the economic impacts of zebra mussels?
What, in terms of a number?
Well, no, not necessarily
Yeah.
the number, but just did it impact shipping or?
As far as I understood, it clogged a lot of pipes. And it probably also had a very large impact on native species, because I think it covers everything. Like, I think it can sort of grow on any possible surface, whether or not it's living or not. And I think that it had an effect on industry. I'm not quite sure what industry, but some that ringed the Great Lakes, because, it grew all along the inside of the pipes and made them impassable. So and shipping as well, because you have to take so many more precautions as it goes from lake to lake. Nobody wants to be last? The last question.
You can ask more questions. We'll break and have some refreshments, and you can ask more questions.
Yeah.
Why did you mention that you didn't want to speak about the mosquito invasion?
Oh, I was torn about the gypsy moth. I thought a lot of people in Massachusetts might know about it, but it also is kind of interesting because it happened right in Medford. And actually my husband and I went to visit the block where it was released. And it's just very interesting to go there and think about, this huge epidemic starting in this one yard, with this one guy with his vials of gypsy moth eggs. So it has that element of interest, but it could also have that element of overflooding. So the thing that I was wondering was, should I talk about the gypsy moth or should I talk about the Hawaiian mosquito? But that's also a really interesting, really sad story. I mean, to me, it's the saddest, maybe just because I like birds, but that these mosquitoes enabled avian transmission of the avian malaria, so that all of a sudden these domestic birds, which had been reservoirs of it, were able to spread it to the birds which had no resistance whatsoever. Well, thank you so much. It's great questions.